morning, everyone. I'm Lauren Cook. I am your Dean of College and Gap Year Advising at JCHS. Excited to have a light launch into the college advising conversation with the sophomore class. This is an annual event that I do to start this college conversation, but keep it kind of casual before the process really starts in earnest next year. And it's purposeful that I'm just talking to you as parents. It's still, I think, a little early for most kids in general. I think that their main job right now is to be a high school student, and that we don't want to, provoke too much anxiety about this process by getting too deep into it too early. But for all of you, I know that the college process, sorry, I've got lots of things happening on my computer, that the college process may inspire some excitement, maybe some anxiety for you as well, perhaps a little confusion, and these are all sort of valid responses. And these responses may be heightened if either you didn't attend college yourself or you attended college outside of the US, so you aren't as familiar with our system. It is a complex one, and that's one of its strengths because we've got this like tremendous diversity of options for college, but it's also a super headache because it is so complicated and specific to the US. And I also just want to name that not one size fits all for JCHS students. We absolutely have students that are looking at the most highly selective institutions and students that are headed on a community college path and everything in between. And all of those options are valid. And I love that we've got students that are on all of these paths because I get to counsel sort of at all ranges of the spectrum. And I do want to just plant the seed for all of you that whatever your own thoughts are on different college paths, that the messages that we send to the kids, they do internalize. And whether or not it's about their path or another kind of path, they also parrot those messages to their friends, right? So as much as we can sort of be sensitive and think big picture and hold all of these different paths as viable options for our students, I would appreciate your support and help with that. So my goals for today, and I'm just going to talk for like 15 minutes or so here at the top, and then the bulk of the time can just be open questions that you might have about the process at this point. I want to just tell you a little bit about myself so you know who's going to be working with you and your kids. Give you a couple of tips that I think will help your students over the next year as they are continuing to try and be more independent and get ready for this process that, I really hope that they will own. Preview a little bit about the path and the process that we do at JCHS so you know a sense, big picture of what's coming in junior year and senior year. And then have the Q&A time, and you can either unmute or put them in the chat, whatever works for you. I would ask right now, as I have like the PowerPoint up, that you don't pop stuff in the chat just because I won't see it. If you've done any presenting on Zoom, it's hard to toggle between these things, but when I stop sharing my screen, I'm happy to entertain any and all questions. And I'll just remind anyone that joined us that I am recording so that we can send this out to parents that aren't able to be with us this morning. So that's a plan. I'll just start by telling you a little bit about who I am. I'm in my 23rd year of college admission. I worked at a selective liberal arts college for the very Jewish number of 18 years before arriving at JCHS to work as a high school counselor. So I've read thousands of college essays. I've conducted hundreds of interviews. I've read many, many, many applications and been involved in numerous workshops on college admission, often with peers from other institutions. So it's not just about the place that I work, but I did have a good sense of the college admission process writ large and a strong sense of what makes a sort of good and solid application for various colleges. I've worked on both coasts and have a pretty extensive network of colleagues who work. We talk about it as both sides of the desk, the high school side and the college side. So I both have a good sense of best practices, but I also have got a pretty deep Rolodex or whatever we're calling it in a more digital age. So that when I do have questions or problems to sort out, I have lots of resources at my fingertips to help me find some answers. I'm also a member of several professional organizations, both regionally and nationally, and hold some leadership roles in those. I'm regularly presenting to my peers on topics around college admission, and I'm also receiving a lot of training and updates about the process so that I can stay fresh and bring all of that news and information back to you and your kids. So that's me sort of in a nutshell, but I'm happy to entertain other questions along the way if they come up. So I want to segue into just talking a little bit about some things to think about over the next year that your students can be working on for some independent skills. So these are sort of age appropriate for sophomores and into junior year, and they're probably going to sound obvious, but they really become applicable when we get into the college search process. So practicing some small talk with adults. And I know that can be a little harder in pandemic world. Normally I'd say like have a dinner party and have some folks over. That's not so safe right now. But if your kids have not been engaging with strangers, you know, here and there that are not their peers and their age, starting to think about ways to do that would be important, because once they actually start the college admission process, they'll be talking to a lot of adult strangers. So college admission reps, alums that they might interview with, tour guides that are in college. And so giving them some ease with having those conversations would be really a useful skill to be working on over the next year. Same thing with drafting emails to adults and emails that look professional. So like if you have been the main one to communicate with some of their faculty or their dean or their advisor, now's the time to start gently shifting some of that communication to your student. Maybe some of your folks are doing that and are perfectly comfortable with it. Terrific. They're going to be set up really well for the process. But if your student is not, or a little more reluctant about that, helping them figure out how to sort of craft the email with "Dear Mr. So-and-so, and here's my question, and here's how I sign my name," you know, and I'm not going to put things in text speak, and I will actually capitalize the beginning of my sentences, that, you know, this is just like something you do for English class. That will also be important because there's a lot of virtual, especially now, communication with colleges, but will happen even more so in the process. And I'm going to keep encouraging your kids as they contact me to say, a school seems to be missing something, or do you know if I can major in this? You know, I'm often going to say, you really should contact the admission rep directly. And I read over things for them and all the rest, but really getting used to doing some of this communication on their own would be important. And then it doesn't have to be a formal resume, although that's great if that's something they want to work on, but starting to keep a list of their involvement during high school. If they haven't done a bit of a brain dump already about what they've been involved in the past 2 years, now would be a great time to start. Because in fall of senior year, you know, a lot of the application process is like data entry, just literally filling out these forms, and all of the applications have activities lists where they ask what you did, what leadership role you had, what years it was in, average number of hours per week, weeks per year. And I help kids parse these things out, but it's great if they're not trying to sort of reinvent the wheel as a senior and remember back, what did I do freshman year and where did I volunteer? So starting to track that now. And the high school years are what's most important. But if someone started piano in 3rd grade or started soccer in 6th grade, you know, sort of thinking back, what was the year I started it? That's a good thing to note if it's like a long-term activity. But in terms of the volunteering they've done or leadership roles, it's really sort of high school that's most relevant for colleges. So start keeping track of that, and then they can just add to it over the next 2 years. It'll make things a lot easier for them on down the road. And then starting to manage some deadlines independently. I know that this is just a general skill that maybe we're all still working on as adults, but certainly in high school that you learn to kind of get a hold of. So if you have been doing a lot of work with your students around homework that's due and test dates and all of that, helping to think about some structures, planners, things that they can be doing to really bolster that executive functioning skill will again serve them well well, just generally in high school, but certainly with this process that is pretty deadline heavy. And I'm certainly keeping track of a lot of things, send a lot of reminders, and they will get signed up in the fall, which I'll get to in a moment, for SCORE, which is the software that we use to help organize the college search. That also will send them some auto reminders on things. But they do need to start, if they're not, feeling sort of stable, figuring out deadlines at this point, to be working on that, because it's only going to get more complicated once they're actually in college, of course, right? And then this last piece, especially if they commute to school, have this down cold, right? Sort of finding their way around somewhere unfamiliar. But if you're someone who drops your kid off at school, or they live close to JCHS, or, they're just a little bit more nervous about finding their way around somewhere unfamiliar, this is another thing to think about working on in the next year or two. Like, go to the Cal campus and say to them, okay, can you find the library for me? Or go to a BART stop and say, all right, let's get to the Union Square Macy's. Can you help me find it? I know my mom did this for me before my senior year of high school. We went on this girls' trip to St. Louis, and we got off the plane. And she said, okay, why don't you find our hotel? And of course, I was enraged, right? That I'm supposed to just be having fun on a vacation. So you're going to get some pushback on this, but it is really important to help them start pushing their way out in the world independently a little bit. I didn't have a cell phone at that point, at least now they can sort of look up some of these things, but that's another thing that's going to help them as you go and visit college campuses and try and figure out where the college town is and whatnot, to give them a little bit of independence as they're figuring out how to explore new places on their own. Okay, so I'm going to pause there on the independent skill piece of things and segue a little bit into what's coming with college advising at JCHS. So what you can expect in junior year and senior year. Note that I'm going to give a simplified version of this, right? I'm not trying to overwhelm anyone. There's lots of steps along the way, but sort of writ large what it is that we're doing. So junior year. So into this summer, probably late July, early August, I will start sending some emails about getting all of you signed up for SCORE. So SCORE is the new Naviance. You might have heard the word Naviance if you've had older kids that have looked at college. This is a newer software platform. I love it. It looks a lot like social media for the kids, that they can heart colleges and follow different things about them. It's very drag and drop and easy for them to use. And this is how we're going to organize their college search and kind of keep in touch with each other about the schools that they're thinking about. You can suggest schools for them. So that's why you would have an account as well. You can kind of peer in on what they're doing. And once we actually get to the application process, it's how I electronically submit their JCHS materials to colleges. So colleges are linked onto SCORE as well. So we'll get that set up next summer. And then as we get into the fall, we will start having colleges visit JCHS. What the visit, sort of as I'm doing air quotes, will look like in the fall, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know yet whether colleges will think it's safe to do recruitment travel again, and whether we'll actually be allowing guests in the building. It may still be sort of a virtual situation, which we have totally figured out from the past year, right? But either way, college reps do come and engage with our students in small groups to give an information session about their school and answer questions. I really encourage juniors to try and go to 5 of those. There's nothing magic about that number, but I think that that's gives them a good sort of scope of things, especially if they attend some different kinds of sessions, a UC, a small liberal arts college, women's college, if you've got a daughter, so they can kind of see what's out there. They don't have to know what they want to do. They don't have to know where they want to be. This is just about exposure and shopping. And then into the winter, we actually have our formal kickoff. So in December, I typically have a whole class and all the parents come together. We did it online this year, but hopefully we'll be back in the theater this winter, where we just, talk about launching the process. And after that, I'll ask everybody to do some questionnaires for me so I can get to know you. I'll have an initial long one-on-one meeting with your child, and I'll draft an initial college list for them and put that in score. Now, of course, if you've been following colleges suggesting them, that may be in there as well. That's great. And it's just sort of a launching place for us to really get serious about some of the schools they'll be looking at. In the spring, there's typically testing. You may have questions about the testing situation, and we can get to that, but there's typically testing in the spring, SAT and ACT. In their junior English class, they're going to actually have an assignment of writing a draft college essay. So we do build that into the curriculum so that they can start writing in the first person, which can be a little awkward, the first time you try it, and to start exploring some colleges. Hopefully by next spring, we're able to fully get back out into the world and sort of stand on a college campus and see what it feels like aesthetically and all of that. And then in the summer, perhaps some more college visits and narrowing in on their list a little bit more into what they might be really excited about. And then into senior year, I do application workshops in the fall. And so I've also been recording some videos this year, which I think has been helpful for folks because they can watch them at midnight if they like. They don't have to just like hold it to that study hall time. I obviously do some one-on-one checking of individual applications. There's more college visits. And as a senior, you're really, I think, a lot more laser focused on places you're thinking about, specific questions on programs. And then we finalize the college list. In the winter, submitting applications, have all that writing finalized. I review everything anyone will send me. I try and get every student to send me everything before it goes out into the world, so I can just make sure all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted. Obviously, there's financial aid to apply for, GAP programs if your students are thinking about that. That process is typically just a little after your applications are submitted, so January, February-ish time. And then in spring, students make a final enrollment decision. It's that easy. It's that fast, right? All right, so I'm just going to wrap up my initial comments here. So in terms of working with me right now, I'm starting some informal conversations. I've had some meetings with some of your, more go-getter kids about their course scheduling for next year, which I'm happy to do. And I will just check over everyone's schedules once they're submitted, even if they haven't met with me, just to make sure from a college advising standpoint, everything makes sense. We'll work formally together starting next year, obviously, and especially once we get to the college kickoff. And I'm happy to take email questions and all of that. But I do just want to name that I'm typically working with half the school at any one time, right? All of the juniors and seniors right now are sort of on my caseload. So I'm trying to not have too many meetings with sophomore families individually at this point, because I do need to preserve my time for the folks that are really in the throes of the process, which I know you will appreciate a couple of months down the road, that I'm protecting my time for your kids. So that are the basics. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and see. Oh, look, it's so great to see some faces. So I would love to know what questions you all have, and you are welcome to put them in the chat. You are welcome to unmute, but now we can just have a conversation. I know that was a lot of information to just throw at you, but again, I'm recording this and we'll send it out to folks later in the week. So what's on your mind?
Hey, Ms. Cook. Yeah, so I'm going to ask a doozy right off the bat. I don't know, there might be some implicit assumptions in your presentation. Do you get involved in advising kids on whether they should go to college and how they should make that decision?
Yeah, I do. And it is actually one of the questions that I ask students in this first questionnaire that I send them next fall, which is, do you want to go to college? And if so, why? And I think that going straight off to college or straight off to a four-year college is not everyone's path and is not always the best choice. I think that sometimes either taking a gap year to have that year to pause, or thinking about doing some work, or thinking about, we've got students that are also interested in trade programs, that kind of thing, that yes, I do have those kinds of conversations with students and parents together and think about what might be the best path. And for some folks, throughout junior and senior year, we're kind of holding a couple of options open. Another common one is thinking about enlisting in the IDF and whether they should even be going through the college process and what that might look like. So yes, all of the paths are open. There's also a really nice tool in SCORE, which again, you'll have some access to later in the summer, called U Science, and that's U like YOU, like the science of you. And it is a series of sort of brain games and quizzes that students can take that will give them some assessment about how their brain works and certain majors or careers that they might be more inclined to. And so that can also help with a bit of a self-assessment. It might give you like 50 options. So some students are like, I could do everything. This is not, helping me. But it also does give you like this 30-page report about like you see patterns clearly, or you, are a very strong communicator, or your vocabulary right now is relatively limited, and that's something to kind of work on. So you do also get some other more kind of like esoteric results to think about for yourself. So that's another tool that I think is useful for folks. All right, got a bunch of questions in the chat. Taking a gap year, does student have to apply to college first and then defer, or do they apply to college after the gap year? Excellent question. I really encourage folks to go through the process with their peers in senior year, even if they're sure they're going to do a gap year. They've got all the resources in place while they're at JCHS, and having their teacher recommendations on file and having me be able to communicate with colleges. And almost every institution is happy to defer that admission for a year. And so getting admitted, you say, I'm going to choose Tulane, and then you send an email to Tulane and say, I'd really like to take a gap year. Here's what I'm planning to do. It doesn't have to be a formal program. I think lots of people think you have to spend $35,000 and have this like 9-month set thing you're doing. It could just be, I plan to intern for 3 months, and then I'm going to have a job to save some money for college, just some sort of plan. And it's usually a perfunctory thing of them approving it. One reason I wouldn't recommend waiting until the gap year is you want to be able to enjoy the gap year, right? And not be actually filling out forms and trying to do something potentially from another time zone if you're traveling or whatnot. The one exception to the deferral, the easy deferral process, can be the UCs or the CSUs. We have seen increased flexibility on their part in the last few years. We've got several students currently on a gap year that will be enrolling at UCLA or Santa Cruz or different places next year. So they are sort of broadening their permission around that a little bit. One interesting thing, though, is that often they have verbiage on their website about if you're doing something religious or military. And so because so many of our kids go to Israel, whether it's a religious program or not, I think that's read as religious by the UCs. So I'll take it, right? So they're still allowing for the deferral. But I would say to go through the process in senior year with their classmates, and then that keeps all the doors open, because kids sometimes change their minds too, right? Okay, what else? How flexible are colleges about deferring the first year? Hopefully, I just answered that. But for a late decision with gap year activity, there's typically some kind of deadline by which they want to know if you're asking for a deferral or not. It might be June 1, July 1. Of course, last year we saw tremendous flexibility with coronavirus. We had kids choosing to take a gap year in September of last year. We had one student show up on campus. There was some COVID breakout. They went home and said, hey, Ms. Cook, where can I go on a gap year? So I think that colleges, can be pretty flexible about it. And gap year programs as well. There are gap programs that could admit you a week before it starts. So not all of them are that flexible, but there's a range of options and timelines there to work with. Just going.
Hey, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I actually have a high school senior this year. So I've been going through this entire process on my own because she's in public school. And I'm just wondering, like, how much support JCHS has. For example, I have spent, numerous hours, rereading essays and just did everything completely on my own. So I'm just wondering like how much help is available through JCHS.
As much as your child is willing to access. So I am practically begging students in September, October, November to send me their writing, their application forms for me to review. And our English faculty are also happy to look over essays as well from a more of a mechanics and shaping framework. So within the school, they definitely have at least 2 adult resources. And I do, advise students to not have too many people reading their essays because it does start to dilute their voice a little bit and can potentially put a little too much adult in there, right? Like colleges are expecting to hear the voice of a 17-year-old. But I spend probably 12 hours a day in the fall and my weekends reviewing essays just nonstop because I do want to lay eyes on everything that I'm able to. And, I should also just name that some students don't necessarily want parental help with this, right? They want to feel like they're either owning it or that they're able to talk about something that might be a little vulnerable or sensitive. And so I'm happy to be sort of a repository for that as well. So, but the short answer is, your tuition dollars are paying for very much one-on-one high-touch personal assistance with us. So, yeah. I'm going to run back to the chat box here and just say there's a question about going into the IDF. Does that require speaking Hebrew? For the most part, yes. And we do have students, especially if they're going in as a lone soldier, meaning, a citizen from outside the country. They go in something called a Mahina, where they're spending either half a year or a year doing sort of pre-army training. And part of that is Hebrew, intensive Hebrew learning, but they're also doing perhaps some Jewish learning or, other types of academic or physical activity. And we've had a lot of students do a range of different programs. So if folks are interested in resources, I can always give you names of that. There's a question about, do you recommend colleges that parents and students do not know? Yes, yes, yes. And I would, if nothing else, ask you to stay open to colleges you have not heard of. There are probably a lot of places you haven't heard of. There are 4,000 some colleges and universities in this country. And while I don't know all of them personally, I do know a lot of them. I know, what's going to work for a kid who's really strong in the arts, who might be a little more counterculture-ish, who wants to be a doctor, who's got, learning differences and really needs support for that. And so some of these schools I put on your kids' list, you may be like, I've never heard of that. What does that mean? So just keep in mind that your colleges haven't heard of your kids either. This is all a sort of like learning process for everyone. And I will want you to sort of to stay open to the recommendations. So yes, I try and hit a broad range.
Question.
Yep.
GPAs and public versus private. I have friends whose sons and daughters are getting 3.7s, 3.8s, 3.9s, 4 point something. I'm going back to my experience. A 3.2 or 3.4 was solid in the old days. Mm-hmm. And now everyone seems to be in the high 3s. Do our kids in private how do they get to this crazy level of above 4?
Yeah. So I'll just back up a moment and say that GPA information is all very much contextual, meaning colleges are not going to look at a GPA of a student at JCHS and the GPA of a student at Lowell and think that they're equivalent to each other, right? Because each high school has its own kind of grading scale, expectations, rigor, grade inflation, and so these are really apples and oranges. One thing that will be useful once your kids are in SCORE next year is we have applicant data and history from JCHS 4 individual colleges in there. So you can compare apples to apples. If your student has a 3.9 GPA and is interested in Brandeis, for example, you can pull up a scattergram of Brandeis applicants from the last 5 years and see who got in with a certain GPA. It's anonymous, it doesn't have names attached to it, right? It's just sort of blunt data. And where the line is of maybe waitlisting and where kids are getting denied. So you can do a more kind of surgical look at, how likely a student is to get into a certain kind of school based on their GPA. But also remember that that GPA number is not everything. It's also about their curriculum. And so, if you have a 3.5, but you've challenged yourself with a number of advanced courses, whether that's getting up to Hebrew 6 or 7, whether that's taking some advanced placement courses, whether that's taking an advanced or honors class, and are getting Bs, that's not altogether different from being a straight A student in a more at-level program. So colleges are also going to parse out, like, what has the curriculum looked like? What is the student interested in? Do they want to be an engineer? Well, do they have strong STEM programming and strong grades there? Or are they thinking about political science, foreign work, and they've taken more than one language? It's all much more complicated than just sort of one data point from the application, which I hope helps, although I know that's also like a more complicated answer. So, yeah. But rest assured that I find JCHS grading to be pretty fair, but I will also note that national trends over the last 15 or 20 years have seen GPAs going up writ large, right? That like everybody's engaging in some amount of grade inflation, and we're not immune to that, but it also means that your kids are not looking like dinged in comparison to other schools, for what that's worth. So. There's a question about, which I think is important. Can you speak to the testing SAT, ACT landscape for sophomores? I cannot do that definitively because, of course, we are still in the middle of a pandemic that has really disrupted this system. But I can tell you some bit about trends. The trend in the past year has been that everyone has gone test optional, with the exception of a handful of public schools in Florida, where their legislature sets what policy is for college admission. And for whatever reason, they have refused to budge on the standardized testing requirement. And we can have a whole separate conversation about the state of Florida. But for the most part, every school has been test optional this year, and lots of schools now are making announcements for the class of 2022, so the juniors, and it looks like that trend is going to continue. I believe that at this point, almost all of the Ivies have weighed in as being test optional. And while I usually don't like to just highlight those extremely selective institutions, for better or for worse, whatever they do sort of cascades on down the line to other institutions. And so I'm getting sort of a landslide now of emails saying we will be test optional for next year. And in the case of the CSUs, so San Francisco State, Cal Poly, the 23 California State University campuses, they are test blind, again, for the junior class, and that may continue. After this, they've had sort of a 2-year experiment with the current seniors and the upcoming junior class. And the UCs have been very slow to come up with their policy for the class of 2022. I actually engaged in a research project last week of checking every single UC website because they're allowing each school to make its own decision. And every UC campus, with the exception of UC San Diego, has now said definitively they will be test blind for the class of 2022, so the junior class. So we'll see what UC San Diego does. But they put an announcement out last May with this kind of 5-year plan saying that they intended to be test blind for the class of 2023, your kids, and 2024. So we're in a weird situation right now where I'm advising the junior class. Some of you may, absolutely want to test. It could be a data point that is helpful for you for places where they are receiving a test score. It's not required, but, if you have a strong test score for however they define that, it could be additive to your application. And if your test score feels average or below, what they've typically printed as their middle 50%, we leave it out. And then it's sort of a value neutral situation. But the UCs and the CSUs are, I think, giving us a glimpse of the future where there are places that actually don't want to see your test scores at all. And so right now, I would guess that testing is going to be part of the pathway for many of your kids. But I think this next year is going to be a really interesting tipping point because there's been a lot of increased public conversation around just how flawed these tests are to begin with. They have a grounding in the eugenics movement, and it's the College Board and ACT are very much for profit at this point in terms of the money-making capacity of these kinds of tests. And so folks are looking at them with a bit more of a cynical eye, and I will absolutely keep you posted about, how this conversation is kind of evolving. So long answer to a simple question, but I don't know for sure, but I think we're headed in what I would consider a better, more holistic direction with the process. There's a question about our child believes GPA is not important. They've been told colleges only look at junior and first semester senior year grades. Please clarify. I would love to clarify. So your GPA matters, your grades matter, all 4 years matter, freshman year matters the least. Both because it is the furthest back in time from the point of application. It is the time when folks are often experiencing transition to high school. Maybe they've gone from public to private and that, has some transition to it, whatnot. And the UCs and CSUs actually don't factor your freshman year grades into your GPA for those campuses. They look at your curriculum, but they don't factor in the actual grades. Private colleges, most of their public institutions, they're going to factor those grades in. So I wouldn't ever say freshman year doesn't matter at all. It's still on your permanent record. But as you get closer to the point of application, things get more and more important. Junior year is the last full year of academic work before you apply. So when folks say that's the most important, that might be what they mean. It's also when you potentially have stepped up a little bit with rigor. Senior year grades matter. And I say this over and over till I'm blue in the face, and seniors are still coming to me saying, I'm in second semester, I can do what I want, right? And that would be a big no. So we often send mid-year reports to colleges. Most require in senior year that you send the grades from the sort of first half of the year. And we let them know that JCHS is on a full year system. So those grades aren't, permanent or official, but they are a snapshot in time of how the student is doing. And then second semester matters too, both because you are completing your permanent record for high school. And, kids never graduate planning to transfer colleges, but kids do transfer. And so what's on your senior year grades matter. And I've had kids come back to me who are planning to transfer and say, man, Ms. Cook, I wish I hadn't kind of written off the last half of senior year. I wish I'd kept up, that record because it would be stronger to send off to a college. But also even the school that you might have already been accepted to, if your grades fall off at the end of senior year, they may revoke your admission. That's a thing that happens, or at least ask what happened, if they see a big difference in your end of senior year grades from what I sent in the middle of the year. So all of it matters. And if for nothing else than to honor, your own integrity and dignity, to not sort of ruin things as you hit the finish line, and the teachers who wrote glowing recommendations for you and all the rest.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that one?
Yep.
So I understand what you're saying about the importance of not falling off at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But our kids right now are only sophomores.
Mm-hmm.
So what about if there's a child who believes that up to sophomore and including sophomore, that GPA does not matter, that he believes that the schools only look at your junior year and the first semester of your senior year? Do you just clarify about that?
Yeah, you can tell him Ms. Cook said he's wrong and that sophomore year, matters. It all matters. And the trend over time. So, colleges, are happy to see an upward trend. So if you had a little rocky start in freshman year, but then you kind of solidify things in sophomore year, get even better in junior year, that is great. Or sort of maintaining, a strong sense of rigor across the board. But my sense is he will sit down with me next year as we start talking about his transcript and his college options, and say to himself, wow, I wish I'd worked a little harder in sophomore year, now that I hear that it matters. I have that conversation, especially with a lot of our young men for some reason, in junior year. So, and if he needs to hear it directly from me, I'm happy to do that as well. But it all matters. This is all their permanent record. So, yeah. Going back to the chat here for a second. Due to COVID, my older son decided to defer. He's been attending local JC. Yeah, this was a great plan. Absolutely. And we have had some students choose to start at community college, and even some that have taken a leave of absence if they were in their sophomore year of college or whatnot, and to be at home and just taken some local community college classes that will transfer to typically their more expensive institution when they return there. So yeah, definitely think about the community college option as something really useful. So question about, can we as a family ask for only schools with really large Jewish communities, Hillel's, Chabad, to be offered to our child? Absolutely. And know that I am always, when I'm creating an initial college list for students, filtering it through a Jewish lens. And I will ask you and your child how much they, care about a strong Jewish community and having that resource, because some have stronger feelings than others. But I do not, for example, populate many lists with a lot of Christian colleges. There are some Catholic schools, Jesuit schools that can be extremely welcoming and have large and robust Jewish populations. But I'm certainly aware of places where our students might feel a little bit more isolated, where there might be super active BDS movements on campus. So these are all things that I'm trying to keep in mind. And I would point you towards Hillel.org now prints a college guide each year that's got some good information about percentages, a lot of links on their websites directly to schools, Hillel's that you can look at. Chabad and the Orthodox Jewish Union also print a list of really strong schools for Orthodox kids. Keep in mind that that list is more limited. It's more like 20 or 25 places, and a lot of them are IB institutions. So it's also not a list that's accessible to every type of student, but it's definitely something that I'm keeping in mind with this search. Question about what is one valuable thing my sophomores can do this summer other than relax, which I want them to do as well. So yeah, and this is tricky. And I'll also just say, I know your kids are sophomores, and this year colleges are going to get has been super bizarre, right? That, mostly online, that last summer things were canceled. This summer, it remains to be seen whether we can actually do some things in person. So I'll just put a big caveat that colleges are going to get that this is like a pretty big speed bump in the road for everybody, and give some grace to that. Because there, of course, I feel like I have to remind students of this, but college representatives are experiencing the pandemic as well, right? Like they get it. They're all working at home. They are gaining weight. They are not able to see their friends. That, they're human beings that are also, assessing your kids with great empathy for right now. But this summer, I think I absolutely want kids to be able to relax a little bit, because being on Zoom for 8 hours a day, it's a lot. They need to move their bodies and be outside and not look at a screen. If we are still in a relatively sort of, shut down kind of place, I think thinking about an online, community college class, BYU class, something like that, could be great if there is an academic path that they haven't been able to access at JCHS. Sometimes we have kids do an economics class or a politics class, or they advance themselves in math, or there's even some art stuff you can do online at this point that would all be useful and, a nice way to spend their time. I think there are probably a lot of service activities that could get them out of the house. So I know that Habitat for Humanity has been continuing to build things. things, the tiny homes over in Oakland, they're working on a lot of those sites, food distribution in a lot of neighborhoods, our homeless situation all across the Bay continues to be severe, especially in the pandemic. So ways that they could be of service would be great. JFCS, so Jewish Family and Children's Services, has also pivoted pretty nicely with their internship programs to put a lot of things online. So you can always look at their opportunities. Often, if you haven't done that before, you can apply for the internship program, and they help place you in different places based on sort of what your interests might be. And those things I think are always lovely for our students to engage in. And, they look good on a college application to have had, sort of an internship before you apply. And doing their own personal interests. So whether that's art at home or yoga or mountain biking or building things, all of that counts too. These things that are sort of like hobbies are absolutely a good use of your time. If your child is a big reader, have them keep a book list of, what they're doing for pleasure, or if they're, writing poetry, that all of these things count. And so all of that is perfectly useful activities as well. And keep an eye on the emails that come out, and they're receiving typically some emails from Ms. Lapina and Ms. Ben David about all of the offers that come into the school as well for internships, work, community service, all the rest. So they are continuing to be offered things to do with their time, and they should say yes to some of that. So okay, what else? Got a question about, did you cover treating changes? And I'm not sure what that means. So I don't know if Larry G is here and wants to say a little bit more about your question in the chat.
Sorry, multitasking in the meetings. I was asking about the testing changes. Just because we've seen an evolution going away from the subject test, and this year the senior class kind of got a pass on testing. Mm-hmm. What do you predict? And I'm sorry if you've covered this before, really to give us some guidance on testing planning. Like, for example, I look at sophomore to junior year as like a key time to get ready for standardized tests, but give us your point of view.
Yeah, I did cover it a little bit earlier, and I'll just summarize by saying there's a big question mark on it right now and what role it's going to play in the process. I would say for sophomores, there is no need to engage in any kind of test prep in the next 5 or 6 months. And I would say that before the pandemic and this disruption, just because test prep is most effective in the 8 weeks before you're actually sitting down for a test, right? You don't want your child to get burnt out on it. There's also the curricular component, so if your student has not taken Algebra 2 yet, if that's coming in junior year, the SAT is a really algebraic test. And so having them start doing math SAT prep right now before they've even covered it in class is going to be like an exercise in a little bit of crazy making, right? So there's curricular reasons to hold off on that until junior year. But now we also have policy reasons, because we have to kind of wait and see what colleges are going to be considering and emphasizing. I don't think everybody's going to be test blind by the time your kids are applying to college. I do think there will still be places that are open to accepting that data point if they have it. But I think we can take a more nuanced approach rather than everybody has to do this, everybody needs test prep, everybody has to spend a bunch of money on it. I think that that we'll have a lot more options in terms of other ways to help them shine in the process if testing, has proven to not be their forte. But I will encourage your kids to engage in the practice tests we will offer in the fall again. We will hopefully be back to a formal PSAT in the fall at school. And so I would want them to do that. And then I always offer a practice ACT to the junior class as well in the fall. And then we look at those 2 practice scores and see, if one test seems to be better for them than another, because they are a little different. And we'll go over those differences and talk about all this in the fall. But that would be the next step. And then we'll make some decisions about do they need to do some test prep? Are they going to test? What kind of schools are they interested in? And what's going to be the best route for your particular student? And I will note that, like so many things with this process, it's not one size fits all, right? So I'm going to give certain advice to one student and different advice to another. These are your kind of like college prescriptions. And I really encourage students not to take each other's prescriptions, right? Because your kids are all sort of unique and different people and learners and all the rest. So.
But you don't see a macro change to move to test optional?
I mean, we've definitely been in that place this year, and I'm seeing that for the class of 2022, it looks as if the test optional landscape is going to stick, and that the test blind landscape for the CSU and the UC is going to stick. So that's what we know right now.
Great, very helpful, thank you.
Yep. And I'm just going to check the chat one more time because I'm aware it's 9 of. In the slide of the beginning of your presentation, you talk about encouraging leadership. Yeah, and I don't know that you necessarily, not everybody has to be a leader, right? Like we also need some followers. We need folks to do some of the marching orders and be the worker bees and get this stuff done. Not everybody's got the grand vision or the organizational planning. But what I was referencing was keeping track of what your kids have been involved with. And so if that has been leadership roles, terrific, and sort of, having them start a Google Doc about, I did this in 9th grade, I did that in 10th grade, but that can also be the volunteering that they've done, the work at their temple, the poetry they had published in the literary magazine, so it's not just about leadership, and know that like leadership in terms of a named role, but that they are doing some things, whether that's contributing to something or sort of sparking their own sort of path as a leader. I hope that clarifies a little bit. Okay, I think we might have run out of questions in the chat box. Oh, do I have a list of internships I just mentioned? No, there's not like a real set list. I did mention Jewish Family and Children's Services. You can go to their website, type in the search box internships, and that page is going to come up. And then I was just sort of rattling off various service options. So as I said, keep an eye on the things that Ms. Ben-David and Ms. Lipkina send your kids. And note that anything that a student is getting community service hours for at JCHS, which is a graduation requirement, both counts as something you can put on your college applications, and you can do more than what's just required. Like that's a good launching pad for, an activity to sort of add to your portfolio. So I'd encourage them not to just delete those things as they come in, because these are ways for them to stay sort of linked into the community and involved going forward. Lots of thank yous. Excellent. I'm so glad.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Okay, great. So I don't know how to phrase this, but how do colleges perceive when all of their lenses are sort of a Jewish lens? So like they go to a Jewish high school, they're involved in lots of extracurriculars, but everything has sort of a Jewish focus. How is that perceived? And should we be encouraging our kids to be doing stuff that is outside of the Jewish community, because that will diversify their profile?
Right. I don't think on the face of it, that's a bad thing. I mean, it's definitely built a narrative about some things that are important to them and to your family. And, presumably they're going to be looking at colleges that have strong Jewish communities. And if anything, it's probably a signal that they are going to contribute to keeping that community thriving here on campus and potentially step into leadership roles there. So I think in most ways it's good. Do know that I'm seeing more and more applications, especially this year. And I do think it's partially been a reaction to a lot of the civil rights stuff over the summer and the George Floyd protests and all the rest. More colleges asking really intentional questions about when have you had an experience with someone different from yourself, or engaged with an idea different from your own, and how did you learn from that or grow from that, or what was that experience like? And so sometimes our kids will approach these questions as, I am an Orthodox Jew coming to a community school, and I learned there's lots of different ways to be Jewish, and that's totally useful. I think it's also great, especially if the rest of their application is sort of like, I'm very Jewish, if they've got another kind of example to work from. Sometimes our kids write about tutoring with kids from the Village Project, doing local work in the Western Addition and that historically African-American community. So be mindful that, sometimes it is helpful in the process, as well as just as human beings, to have some interactions that are sort of outside the Jewish community. But on the face of it, I don't think that's like a problem. So hope that helps. I'm going to do one last scan of the chat. Excellent. Yeah, no other questions. Any last burning questions? I want to respect people's time, so we will close in 4 minutes so we can all get on with the day. Anything else on your mind? I'll just note that we do have a sort of deeper dive into financial aid next Monday night, which you are welcome to attend, but do not have to attend. It's still a little early for sophomore families, but if you know that you're going to need some significant aid in the process, I think it doesn't hurt, even if you don't follow everything, to let the phrases and the terms and the paperwork sort of wash over you on Monday and begin to get familiar with some of the terminology around financial aid, especially if it's your first time through the process. And I may do another one of these coffees for sophomore families later into the spring as well, especially depending on what happens with the reopening schedule and all of that, just because I think since I can't see all of you at soccer game half times or at play intermissions or other times when we might be able to just run into each other for casual conversations, just make sure that you're feeling like you've got some access to me before we fully
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, please, Sarah.
Okay, so I do definitely agree that there's a trend away from testing. I know, for example, like USC said they're still test optional for our kids' grades. So I'm wondering, since there's going to be a smaller amount of data points for them to decide whether they want their, your child at their school, what has become more significant? Is it the essay? Is it the extracurriculars? Is it your testing? Because they have a smaller set of information now. So where is the emphasis going to?
Excellent question. I would say that the center point of every application has always been the transcript. Your grades and your curriculum are the most important piece in terms of making an admission decision. That was true before, the big test optional surge, and it's true now. And I will also note that before, the pandemic started, there were 800 some colleges that were test optional, and a range from, your highly selectives like University of Chicago, to your really broad access like University of Arizona. So this is not new as in the past year. And so, folks have been moving in this direction and know how to assess files without that data point. I don't know that anything has necessarily replaced it, but I do think that, the essay is very important, and that's probably, without a test score, the sort of second most important piece, or sort of collectively the writing, because often there is one longer essay and then maybe some short answers, as I mentioned, like the sort of diversity shorter question answer that a lot of places request. But your activities, what you're involved in, not so much placing a judgment on like being Roche is better than being on the soccer team is better than being a Subway sandwich artist, right? Like there's not a hierarchy of types of things that are better to do than others, but I do think they place some judgment on why students have made those choices, what they've gotten from it, being reflective about it. Have they committed to things over time, or are they sort of bouncing from thing to thing or adding a laundry list in junior year? So sort of looking to see what they've committed to. And the narrative, as I mentioned, earlier, if you've got a lot of Jewish stuff, that's great. There's a narrative there about what's important to you. And then recommendations, and if you choose to do an interview, and some of these other things sort of round things out. But I think your transcript, your writing, and that involvement, those are sort of three really, really core things for making admission decisions. And I also think we shouldn't forget a match with that particular institution. And I think that that's especially important for a school like USC. They really want to know that you know them, you know what you want to major in, and you can tell them some things about them and why that's a good match for you as a student. And so doing your homework and then sort of being able to show evidence that you've done your homework about that institution can be a tipping point piece as well. And that's something we'll talk more about next year and in senior year. So I'm going to pause there, naming that it's 9 a.m. Thank you all for hanging in for this whole hour. I hope it was helpful. And stay in touch if further questions come up, and I'll let you know if we're able to gather again later this spring. All right. Very good. Thanks, everyone. Have a good morning.